motion of the House reads, this House prefers movements prioritizing a local climate agenda over a global one. Now, before we get into it, let's define a few things here. By a local climate agenda, we mean an agenda that is geared towards achieving or solving the issue of climate change at the local level. And by local level, we mean in specific countries, cities, and communities and certain local jurisdictions. By global climate agenda, we mean an agenda that is geared towards solving climate change at a global level. Now, we as a house, our objective here is to show you that why these movements that prioritize a local climate agenda are more effective and provide higher quality solutions as opposed to the movements that are geared towards a global climate agenda. We need to understand, or we need to note a few things as we get into this. First, it is political will and communal will, and also commitment. We need to understand these things and how they play a role in this. Now, talking about political will, for an issue like climate change to be solved at a local level, we need to understand that these people who are at the local level are the most knowledgeable about the context in which they operate, which is required in achieving a change at their level. So these people are the ones that are best equipped to solve this solution. They have the political will, and the community, since it is the one that is affected by this issue of climate change, they understand these effects, so they have that communal will to solve the issue. Talking of a global agenda is just some people at the top who are just talking about it and they're not showing much action, and as I'm going to show you that. Talking of movements that prioritize a local agenda, a very close to home movement is the Green Belt movement, which was started by Wangari Maathai and 40 other women in local Kenya who had an issue of lack of water in their communities. So they decided to plant trees in order to solve this issue, and this led to establishments or a certain ripple effect that led to this issue being brought into other communities. So other communities started planting trees. Even environmental clubs were established at schools and other institutions around Kenya. This has shown progress. It has provided a solution, and it shows that these movements that prioritize a local climate agenda are more effective, and there's success that has already been shown by this Green Belt movement. This can be replicated in other movements, and is also going to show successes. Now they have a place or a blueprint to follow. Talking of a global climate agenda, or movement prioritizing a global climate agenda, we need to look at the 2015 Paris Agreement. The 2015 Paris Agreement, the United States, which was a key signatory here, decided to withdraw from the agreement. Their withdrawal from the agreement showed that there's lack of commitment. Being lack of commitment means that they were not responsive to this, and it also shows that they are not going to provide solutions that are more effective because they're not that much committed into it. Failure of this international action, therefore, means that we should get or give more attention to local climate agendas. These movements prioritize local climate agendas, and by doing this, we're going to solve the issue of climate change. So what we are telling you is movements that prioritize a local climate agenda, they're more effective, they provide this political will in these movements, and they are going to solve this issue in our communities. Thank you.
Now we have to understand what a global agenda looks like. Looks like looking at the topmost contributors of carbon emissions and looking for ways in which this can be reduced in a bid to solve climate change. So what you're going to get from my speech is, 1, why do we think that developed countries are the topmost contributors of these carbon emissions? 2, how does this really affect the local governments, even the local monarchy? 3, why we think that local government in its capacity is not really at a good position to solve this climate change? And lastly, why is it that global agenda is the best metric on how we are going to tackle climate change? So firstly, Now, why do we really think that developed countries are the topmost contributors? Now, in the African context, all we hear about is the investments that come from countries like, for example, USA, investment that comes from countries like UK, countries like Russia. Now, what this looks like, for example, in the DRC Congo, you look at the multinational corporations that operate in these mining sites. These organizations usually contribute to these carbon emissions. And how is this so? We think that the mere fact that they are developed countries and they expand in the developing countries in a bid, or rather so as to invest and expand their economy, we think that this actually leads to carbon emissions in the sense that, one, we hear things to do with river pollution, we hear things to do with toxic air that has been emitted, we hear things to do with deforestation. All these affect these local people living within that local jurisdiction. In as much as these developed countries have stabilized economies, but still, in a bid to expand, they affect these developing countries that solely depend on these kind of investments and these kind of expansions. So why do we really think that local governments are not really at our best position to solve this problem? Now, when you look in the sense that these local governments depend on these expansions, or rather multinational corporations, in terms of employment, in terms of actually developing in terms of their GDP. Now, this means that these local governments cannot really cut off this kind of dependency because, one, they feel like it supports them. But then again, even if you were to say that local governments have been effective in terms of the Green Belt movement that the proposition talked about, or in the sense that sensitization and education, but we still think that local governments do not really have the capacity to fight these multinational corporations or to fight countries like USA, countries like Russia. So at a point in time, we feel like local governments are not really at a good position to tackle these big industries and organizations. We think that movements focusing on the global agenda, or rather movements that focus on these multinational corporations and, one, have the capacity, two, have the ability to face these countries, are at a better position to tackle the major problem of climate change. When you look at deforestation, yes, local governments have done a very good job in appealing for afforestation, but has this really solved the issue to do with carbon emissions that are on the rise? Has this really solved the issue to do with industrialization that is spreading in developing countries, and this is solely contributing to global warming? So we think that when movements focus on global agendas, it's going to help this because, one, these movements are going to tackle these big organizations, to tackle these big industries, to ensure that the emissions that are, the carbon emissions are at a lower level. We also think that they are at a better position to ensure that actually there is a balanced equation, in the sense that as local governments sensitize people on education, but these movements are focusing on the bigger problem, and the bigger problem is that there is high carbon emissions. So at a point in time, we hear that USA, we hear that Russia, China are expanding in these developing countries. These movements are able to minimize the kind of emissions that are released, and also this helps to ensure that the local jurisdiction, the local mwananchi, do not end up drinking water that has been contaminated, do not end up having children sick because of these actually carbon emissions. So we think that this is very much important and attains the main goal, which is solving climate change.